Well, Farhan, thank you so much for coming on. I am sad to say that this might be the last time that we ever talk now that the CFL, I am kidding because actually, we were going to have you on this week. I'm very interested in all the training camp stuff, the vaccination protocols, everything else with the CFL. So we're going to do all of that too. So Farhan, we were scheduled. We're going to do all the breaking XFL, CFL stuff now. I'm going to actually break this out as a standalone video today to kind of hopefully get some of the buzz. And then we will add on to this and then put that on our episode on Friday. So if you're checking out the episode today, make sure to subscribe. Come back Friday. We're going to do all the CFL stuff too. Farhan, I'm sure a busy day for you. How are you reacting to all of this news?
Well, surprised at the timing, but not really surprised that we're at this point. I got the sense from people I'd been talking to in the last couple of weeks that this might be headed in this direction. It had been pretty quiet for well over a month now, right, in terms of the two leagues and where they're at. And, we were kind of led to believe that it got to a point where they needed to get this to the analysts and see what the actual numbers for this whole thing were going to look like. And I just don't think that they were able to get much in the way of clarity, right? There were still a lot of questions, both financially in terms of what it would look like and logistically, right? In terms of what the league would physically look like, in terms of where the teams would be on the XFL side, in terms of player acquisition and retention. There was a number of things that were still in play, some of which you were going to be able to overcome because that's just part of bargaining and negotiations. But I think on the financial side, there just wasn't a lot of clarity. There was a lot of hope. There was a lot of potential, but there wasn't necessarily a lot of meat on the bone at the front end. And I just don't think there was enough there ultimately for the CFL governors to decide they wanted to jump completely into this. And I think from an XFL standpoint, I think they wanted some clarity as well because of what's happening with the USFL and the fact that the USFL is planning to launch in 2022 with a television deal with Fox. I think they were anxious to kind of have some news and move forward on what they were doing. And ultimately the mechanics of the deal just weren't there where the CFL governors felt comfortable making that leap of faith.
How are you, obviously as someone that covers the league, as a proponent of, growth, how are you reacting to this personally?
Well, I'm disappointed to a degree, right? I think there was some exciting things around what it could have looked like. But again, more than anything, I was excited at the notion that Redbird Capital and The Rock and Danny Garcia and their promotional might could have put the Canadian Football League in really good financial footing, right? But I think during this process, I think what people around the CFL learned was just how much they were bringing to the process, right? And, when you enter this on both sides, you're in the throes of COVID and everything looks so bleak. And then in the last month, things are turning up. Vaccination rates are better. CFL is going to start playing its games again. And as you go through the process, you realize just how much this league is bringing to the equation in terms of its infrastructure. The fact that you've got football teams you've got 9 teams that are up and running. You've got established fan bases. You've got a television deal. So how does that work, right? I mean, at the front end, would the CFL have been expected to turn over half its TV deal, half its sponsorship deals, all of those things in an attempt to get more on the back end, right? I mean, there were just a lot of those types of questions. But I think as much as anything, CFL people who were very open to this at the governor level realized that, look, I think we can be okay. We've got the single game betting coming in now. You've got things like, revenue sharing and other adjustments to the business model that they've been forced to make during COVID and we're going to make long term. So maybe we're in a better position than we think, that we don't need to just do this out of desperation.
Yeah, that's kind of what I think. I mean, we've noticed on the show lately that, as all this single game sports betting talk has ramped up, as the, obviously COVID and everything has cooled down a little bit, that it did seem like this cooled, right? The talks were maybe 4 months ago or, back in October, whenever all this started, that it did seem a little more bleak. Is that kind of your beliefs as well?
Yeah, I think there's some truth to that. And look, I do believe that when the governors got into this at the front end, there was a certain amount of desperation, but, I do think they believed that, look, this league had some financial issues before COVID, right? I mean, you look at a team like the Winnipeg Blue Bombers who made a little bit of money. I mean, a lot went right for the Bombers to eventually win the Grey Cup to only make a little bit of money, right? Now, their numbers are a little bit different because they're also still, there's a new stadium that's just been put in both in Saskatchewan and in Winnipeg. And so their financials look a little bit different when you've got to pay off portions of that. But I think overall, I think there was a feeling that the business model was broken and that, when you look at The Rock and you look at Danny Garcia and you look at Redbird Capital, you see potential and you see, you see glitz and you see glamour and you see things that could potentially bring a lot. So I think they did try to do it from the standpoint of, look, even without COVID, this league had some financial issues in 2019 and before that. So we use COVID to springboard and to take us into an area that maybe we wouldn't have seriously considered before. But, ultimately that wasn't enough, and they need a little bit more.
In terms of, I've already seen people commenting, they're putting a pin in this now. They're going to come back, to these, because whatever the statement said, it's put on pause for the time being. Yeah. Do we hop back on the horse here? I don't really know.
I don't think so. Like, I think today it's over. I believe that. I understand that both leagues put at this time on their press releases, but I think as of today, there's not going to be any need to revisit the discussion. Now, in 3 years, if the XFL is playing football games and the CFL is in a different financial situation and, there's more of a need, you don't know what it's going to look like in 3 years. But I don't believe from the people I've spoken to today that the pause is actually a pause. I think they're moving forward, both entities independently. If there's a reason to come back later, maybe they revisit that, but I don't believe that's part of the plan to put the brakes on this.
The people you've been talking to, are they disappointed? Are they relieved? Obviously I've seen a lot of, CFL fans, relieved with everything.
Yeah. Depends who you talk to. I think there are certain owners that are disappointed, and I think there's some that are probably relieved. You look at the statement that the Edmonton Elks put out where they said that, we're happy about this and we're happy to preserve this type of, the game that we've got and all of that. So yeah, maybe, as a community-owned team with their constituents, maybe they're in a certain place, but there are others that I've talked to that are disappointed. I think they went into this really, really hoping that there would be, a lot more financial meat on the bone, to make this go, right? I think there was a lot of excitement at the potential of this at the front end. So, but at the same time, there are people who feel better about the CFL situation with the single game betting, with some of the other adjustments that they've made, like we talked about earlier, the revenue sharing and things like that. I think some of those things are going to add immediate franchise value to some teams that are looking for it. So, there's both. But I think as much as anything else on the CFL side right now, let's just get on with 2021. I think that's probably the biggest sentiment that I'm getting right now from the league office, from governors and others.
As someone that I'm now an Elks fan, I didn't know that they were so anti XFL. I might have to I have my flag here. I might have to really reevaluate that. A couple more questions on this, and then obviously I want to get into the season stuff. We had Rod Peterson back on the show a couple weeks ago, and a lot of our conversation was about really the hostility, right, that kind of came out with these talks, with the fans, with everything.
Not for me.
Well, no, and not from, but from that small, but it's a vocal. Yeah. That's who I hear. That's who's, on
sure.
things. And, Rod said the same thing, in our wildest dreams, we never could have imagined it would have gotten so contentious. Right. And I think that, maybe, the hires up at both the XFL and CFL maybe didn't anticipate that either, that it would just get the vitriol would be so thick.
Yeah, I don't think that really played a role, but I do believe, and this was always the case from the beginning, there was going to have to be something substantial for those people to go back to their teams and their fan bases and say, hey, listen, this is the better thing to do, right? And, it changes. The temperature changes in different cities, and the temperature also changes with different age groups, right? And who you are. There are people that are going to be protectionist, and they're just not going to want change. They're just not going to want evolution. They're not going to want to look at this with any sort of open eyes, right? It was going to be glass half empty regardless, right? So that was going to be there. But I really don't believe, from talking to those teams, that they experienced a lot of that vitriol firsthand. I don't think there were thousands of fans in Winnipeg and Saskatchewan and even in Edmonton that went to those teams and said, we're out. Were there dozens of upset people? Sure. But were there thousands? No, I don't believe that for a second. So I don't think that had anything to do with it. That said, and I said this again when we were on the first time, was that, you still have to go back to those people and look those people in the eye and say, this is why we're changing. And you're going to have to give them something tangible, not just hope, in order to tell them why they're changing. And they just couldn't get to that.
Is this the right decision to make ultimately?
Yeah, I think so. From what I've heard today and where the talks were at, right? And this is not an anti-XFL guy, right? Like, I'm not that guy. So I just think that right now, based on where they are, the XFL has still got a lot of questions to answer internally, right? In terms of where their cities are going to be, because, I think there's an assumption that you're just going to pick up those 9 teams. I don't know that that's the case. What their TV contract is going to look like, what their infrastructure, what they were left with, right? Because I understand that Redbird and Garcia and The Rock got the assets, but what were those assets, right? I mean, and were they enough to really build full football operations from, right? Because in some cases they were just contracts, right? They weren't necessarily a bunch of computers and pads. I mean, there was a little bit of that, but so, when you look at the actual costs, when the Redbird Capital folks looked at the actual costs to get this off the ground from a staffing and infrastructure perspective through to 2023, and you're going to have to lose millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions at the front end in order to make the money at the back end. I mean, that's just, they knew that when they launched a few years ago, right? So I think when you look at all of that, I think this is probably the best thing for both sides. Both sides now have some clarity and they can kind of move forward with it.
Yeah, it's just a shame it took so long. I mean, already I'm hearing, as much as we criticize some of the CFL fan base for being, homers or, holding on,
old school, yeah,
XFL, and I'm like, guys, you have far less of a lineage to be really clinging on to. I mean, I try to, play both sides. Any other thoughts on the XFL stuff before we transition to the CFL at hand?
You know what? I hope it's successful. I really do. I want to see a spring league work. And, there are people, and I was one of these at one point that didn't want to see it work. And not the XFL specifically, but spring football generally. I was just that guy that, forget it. The NFL, it's just never going to happen. But, I just believe that when you look at the numbers, and I think there are enough fan bases that will support it to the point, I use MLS as the example, right? Because really the MLS, it's not necessarily profitable, but there's franchise value. Right? I mean, there's not huge television dollars. There's not huge attendance at the majority of games. Yeah, there are some outliers, but yet somehow they've managed to create a business model that creates franchise value. So I would love to see television ratings, for an XFL be able to sustain NHL type levels in the United States, like they showed for their first 5 weeks that they had a season last year. I'd like to see it happen. I think more football is good for everybody. It's more opportunity for coaches, for players, for fans, for gamblers, for everybody. So I just don't see why having something like that succeed is bad. I mean, I think it just forces the CFL to get better. I think this whole exercise forced the CFL to get better. It forced the CFL to take a deeper look at itself. So I hope the XFL works.
I lied. I have one more question. I want your reaction to right when this came out, friend of the show, Rosh Madani tweeted, look at all this wasted time. We spent all this time. We could have rebuilt, the CFL could have worked on all these other things in the meantime. Reaction to that people feel like the last 4 or 5 months, 6 months has been a waste of time?
It's not been a waste of time because of what I just said. I think it forced the league to take a deeper look at itself and what it valued, right? I mean, when the CFL went through its U.S. expansion in the 90s, some people view that as an unmitigated disaster, right? Because those franchises failed. And ultimately Baltimore came to Montreal and that one worked. But as far as U.S. expansion in the States, it failed. I don't believe that whole exercise was a failure because the CFL came out of it much stronger than it had been going into it, right? So you have to look at the big picture. And for me, again, the CFL did work on its business model. They did make some changes just to get on the field for 2021. And so I think a lot of good has come of it. And it's 4 months. Like, really? Right? Like, for an institution that's been around over 100 years, we're going to get all bent out of shape because they took a look at 4 months. The league, the commissioner, the league office, they owed it to themselves. They owed it to their owners. They owed it to their fans to overturn every rock, literally and figuratively, to make sure that there wasn't, a pot of gold at the end of it, right? Like, look at it legitimately. Don't just naysay on everything, right? That's what gets the league into the financial peril it's in now. People refusing to try different things. So I'm glad they tried it. And if this is the right solution, good on them.
Perfect. So we'll clip this off. If you're listening, please tune into the whole show on Friday.